There are faces in Hollywood that time refuses to erase. Among them, few are as hauntingly unforgettable as Gene Tierney's. She was the woman whose emerald green eyes could silence a crowded theater, whose very presence seemed to shimmer with a strange mixture of innocence and danger. Audiences in the 1940s fell under her spell, as though she were less a performer and more a vision conjured by the silver screen itself. Yet, behind that beauty so precise, so flawless, so legendary, lay a story that Hollywood preferred to forget. A story drenched in sorrow, illness, and the kind of tragedy that no amount of applause could ever mend. To those who saw her in Laura, 1944, Gene Tierney was the ultimate dream. A woman painted in mystery, whose absence defined the film's entire plot, yet whose image was strong enough to dominate every frame. Critics hailed her as a goddess of cinema, directors called her a muse, and fellow actors found themselves both enchanted and intimidated by her poise. But while the public adored her, Jean herself often looked into the mirror and saw a stranger, a fragile soul, trapped inside an image she could never fully live up to. The world demanded perfection, and she delivered it with chilling precision, even as her own life spiraled into chaos. Her eyes, always described as emeralds in shadow, became symbols of unattainable beauty. Photographers chased that gaze, fashion houses begged her to endorse them, and gossip magazines fed the public with fantasies about her glamour. But what those magazines did not print were the nights of endless weeping, the haunting guilt she carried over her daughter's illness, and the silent wars waged within her own mind. The truth was that Gene Tierney was fighting demons that beauty alone could never defeat. This story is not merely about a Hollywood star. It is about the cruel collision between fame and fragility. It is about how the very spotlight that immortalized her also burned her from within. How a chance encounter at a World War II canteen, where a fan approached her while sick with rubella, would alter her life in ways more devastating than any script could ever imagine. How one mistake, one virus, one twist of fate left her carrying a burden she would never put down. A child born with severe disabilities and a guilt that consumed her for decades. Hollywood wanted its goddess to remain perfect, but perfection has a price. As Jean's career soared, her personal life fell apart. Marriages crumbled, lovers drifted away, and her sanity became the most fragile of all. Institutions, electric shock therapy, whispers of madness. These were the shadows lurking just beyond the glowing marquee lights. Each time she returned to the screen, audiences believed she was whole again. Each time, she was hiding another fracture, another scar, another silent scream. In telling Gene Tierney's story, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth about Hollywood itself. This was an industry that worshipped beauty, yet discarded broken souls. It celebrated illusions while ignoring the suffering of the very people who created them. Gene Tierney was not simply a victim of illness or fate. She was a victim of the system that demanded she smile when her world was collapsing, that she embody perfection when perfection was impossible. As the curtain rises on her life, we are drawn into a paradox, a woman adored for the very mask that destroyed her. She was luminous, but she was also lost. She was unforgettable, but she was also unforgiven, especially by herself. And so, behind those legendary emerald eyes, there was always a sadness that no audience could quite see, but that her soul never escaped. This is not just the story of Gene Tierney, the Hollywood goddess. It is the story of Gene Tierney, the human being beautiful, broken, and tragically unforgettable. Before Hollywood immortalized her as one of the most captivating faces of the 20th century, Gene Tierney was simply a girl growing up in a world far removed from the spotlight. Born Jean Eliza Tierney on November 19, 1920, in Brooklyn, New York, She was the daughter of Howard Sherwood Tierney, a successful insurance broker, and Belle Lavinia Taylor, a former teacher. The family was comfortably middle class, later settling in Green Farms, Connecticut, where Jean's childhood unfolded in a home marked by discipline, refinement, and quiet expectations. Her parents instilled in their children the values of education, manners, and ambition, but also an emotional distance that would leave Jean yearning for warmth she rarely received. Even as a child, Jean possessed a striking presence. Relatives often remarked on her extraordinary eyes, green with golden flecks that seemed to change with the light. While most little girls played with dolls, Jean carried herself with an elegance that felt almost cinematic from the start. She was tall, graceful, and reserved, an old soul in the body of a child. Her beauty was both a gift and a burden. Teachers and neighbors praised her endlessly for her looks, but behind the compliments, Jean felt the weight of expectation. To be beautiful, even as a girl, meant to behave perfectly, to remain poised, to never reveal weakness. That early conditioning would follow her for the rest of her life. Her father was a proud, often demanding man. He saw Jean not only as his daughter, but as a reflection of the Tierney name and reputation. He encouraged her education but discouraged overt displays of emotion. Her mother, by contrast, was more nurturing but equally concerned with appearances. Belle Tierney dreamed of her daughter marrying well, fitting seamlessly into the world of high society. The Tierney household was not abusive, but it was rigid, formal, and often cold. Jean grew up surrounded by rules and expectations, but starved for emotional intimacy. It would later make her vulnerable to the charms and betrayals of men who offered her the affection she so desperately craved. As a student, Jean thrived academically. She was intelligent, articulate, and fluent in French, thanks to her education at elite schools. Her parents later sent her to a finishing school in Switzerland, a gesture that reflected both privilege and control. Abroad, Jean discovered art, literature, and a life beyond the narrow confines of her upbringing. She also discovered herself. For the first time, she felt a sense of independence, walking through European streets where no one knew her name, free from the weight of being the beautiful Tierney girl. Those years abroad planted in her a seed of longing for adventure, for escape, for a life larger than the one prescribed to her. But it was back in America where fate began to write her story. Jean's beauty was impossible to ignore. Friends and acquaintances often suggested she should try modeling, perhaps even acting. At first, she laughed it off. Hollywood seemed like another planet, reserved for people born into stardom or stumbled upon by chance. Yet, chance was about to intervene. During a family trip to Warner Brothers Studios in Hollywood, Jean caught the attention of director Anatole Litvak, who insisted she should test for films. The idea thrilled her but horrified her father, who considered acting a disreputable profession. "No daughter of mine will parade herself on a stage," he reportedly said. His disapproval cut deep, but Jean's yearning for freedom burned even deeper. In truth, Jean's desire to perform was not rooted in vanity but in liberation. Acting, she believed, would allow her to step into other lives, to express emotions forbidden in her own. On screen, she could laugh, weep, rage, and love in ways her upbringing had never allowed. To her, cinema was not about fame. It was about release. It was about becoming whole. Her early steps into the world of theater were tentative. Jean began on Broadway, where her ethereal beauty caught the eye of critics almost instantly. Though inexperienced, she radiated a natural magnetism that no training could manufacture. Audiences leaned forward whenever she entered the stage, as though some invisible force pulled them closer. She was not yet a skilled actress, but she didn't need to be. Her face told stories on its own. Stories of longing, vulnerability, and mystery. Hollywood producers soon took notice, and before long, Gene Tierney was swept into the machinery of the studio system. Yet, beneath the glamour of her rising career, Gene carried with her the echoes of childhood. She remained sensitive, almost fragile, to criticism. Any harsh word struck her like a wound, a remnant of years spent trying and failing to win unconditional approval from her father. She longed for love, for validation beyond her looks, but too often found herself defined by them. The very beauty that opened doors for her also built the cage she could never escape. Those early years shaped not only the actress Gene Tierney would become, but also the woman who would struggle against herself for the rest of her life. She was raised to be perfect, to be admired, to never reveal cracks in the facade. But perfection is a brittle mask, and as Hollywood embraced her, that mask would begin to crack. For now, though, Gene's story was still at its dawn. She was the girl with emerald eyes, stepping onto a stage that would both crown her and curse her. And though she could not know it yet, the shadows of her childhood discipline, without warmth, beauty, without freedom, were already waiting to follow her into the bright, merciless lights of Hollywood. When Gene Tierney first stepped into the world of Hollywood, she was unlike anyone else. The studios were filled with starlets, each hoping to be discovered. But Gene was something different. She didn't have to try. The camera found her. It lingered on her face, drank in the angles of her cheekbones, the impossible green of her eyes, the way she seemed to hold a secret in her silence. She was the kind of woman who didn't just act, she haunted. And that quality was what made her rise inevitable. Her earliest screen appearances were modest, but they carried a strange electricity. By the early 1940s, 20th Century Fox had her under contract, and she quickly transitioned from ingenue roles into more substantial parts. Hollywood's publicity machine worked furiously to shape her image. She was promoted as the most beautiful woman in film, a title that thrilled audiences but left Gene uneasy. To be admired for beauty alone was a double-edged sword. She wanted to be taken seriously as an actress, yet the industry and the public were mesmerized by her face. The turning point came with Laura in 1944. Otto Preminger's noir masterpiece was a gamble, built on the idea of a woman who exists more as a memory than a presence, more as a dream than a flesh-and-blood character. Gene was cast in the titular role, and it became the performance that defined her. Audiences fell in love with her not just as Laura Hunt, but as the embodiment of an unreachable fantasy. The film was a hit, critics raved, and Gene Tierney was elevated to the ranks of Hollywood's greats. But the success of Laura came with a shadow. From that moment forward, Gene was trapped in her image. She was no longer simply an actress. She was a symbol. Producers wanted her to play the icy beauty, the mysterious woman, the untouchable goddess. Roles poured in, Leave Her to Heaven, 1945. Dragonwyck, 1946. The Razor's Edge, 1946. Each cementing her as Hollywood royalty. Yet, even as her career soared, Gene found herself hollowed out inside. She was adored but not understood. She was praised but not known. It was in Leave Her to Heaven that Gene delivered what many still consider her greatest performance. As Ellen Barrett, the obsessive woman whose love turns destructive, Gene displayed a chilling intensity that stunned critics. The film became one of Fox's highest-grossing hits of the decade and earned Gene an Academy Award nomination. For once, she was recognized not just for her beauty, but for her talent. Still, the praise was bittersweet. Playing Ellen felt close to home, a woman trapped by her own perfection, consumed by emotions she could not control. It was as though Gene was channeling not just a character, but her own unspoken despair. Behind the scenes, Hollywood was relentless. The studio system treated actors as commodities, and Gene was no exception. Her schedule was grueling, her personal life constantly scrutinized. She attended premieres draped in gowns, her every move photographed, her every smile dissected. Gossip columns speculated about her romances, often exaggerating or inventing stories to keep her in the headlines. Gene smiled for the cameras, but privately she longed for something simpler. Love, stability, and a chance to just be herself. Her love life was indeed complicated. She married Oleg Cassini, a dashing costume designer known for his sophistication and charm. Together, they were a glamorous couple, admired wherever they went. But marriage in Hollywood was never easy, and for Gene, it was a battlefield of conflicting desires. She wanted family, children, a home. Cassini wanted adventure, ambition, and freedom. Their union was passionate but turbulent, marked by betrayals and reconciliations that left Gene's heart scarred. Yet, for all her struggles, Gene Tierney was at the height of her power. She was a star who seemed to embody the very essence of the 1940s. Her face graced magazine covers, her films drew massive audiences, and her name became synonymous with allure. Directors adored her, co-stars admired her, and fans worshipped her. But success came at a terrible price. The more the world idolized her, the more Gene lost sight of herself. Hollywood is often described as a dream factory, but for Gene Tierney, it was more like a mirror maze. Everywhere she turned, she saw a reflection of what others wanted her to be. Rarely did she see herself. She had dreamed of acting as a way to explore freedom, to live other lives beyond the confines of her upbringing. Instead, she was caged again, this time by fame itself. Her rise was meteoric, dazzling, and unforgettable. Yet even in her most triumphant moments, there were cracks in the facade. Colleagues noticed her mood swings, her sudden disappearances from social gatherings, the moments when her emerald eyes, so celebrated on screen, seemed dimmed by an invisible weight. Gene was carrying secrets, and soon those secrets would unravel into a tragedy that would define the rest of her life. Because while Hollywood celebrated her as untouchable, life was preparing to remind her brutally that she was all too human. By 1945, Gene Tierney had achieved what countless actresses only dreamed of. She was not just a Hollywood star, she was a Hollywood legend in the making. The war was ending, the world was hungry for beauty, and Gene embodied the fragile hope of a generation exhausted by violence and uncertainty. When her face appeared on screen, audiences believed in something beyond themselves. She was elegance in the midst of chaos, a symbol of perfection in a world that had been torn apart. Leave Her to Heaven became her crowning jewel. As Ellen Barrett, Gene delivered a performance so complex, so icy yet vulnerable, that critics hailed it as a masterpiece of psychological acting. When Ellen allowed a child to drown while she looked on with chilling serenity, audiences gasped, not because of the scene's horror, but because Gene Tierney made it believable. The Academy recognized her with a nomination for Best Actress, and suddenly she was not just a star defined by beauty. She was an artist. For Gene, the recognition should have been a triumph, but privately it was a bittersweet wound. Playing Ellen felt too close to home, a reflection of her own inner turmoil, her fear of failing as a woman, a wife, a mother. At the same time, her marriage to Oleg Cassini was entering its most complicated chapter. Cassini adored Gene, but he also adored the world, its women, its parties, its endless distractions. Gene, raised with discipline and longing for stability, tried to balance her career with her desire for family. She gave birth to her first daughter, Daria, in 1943, but the child's birth was marred by tragedy. During her pregnancy, Gene had contracted rubella from an overzealous fan who approached her at a wartime USO appearance. The result was devastating. Daria was born deaf, partially blind, and severely developmentally disabled. For Gene, The news was not simply heartbreaking, it was catastrophic. She blamed herself relentlessly, carrying a guilt that would shadow her for the rest of her life. This personal anguish contrasted cruelly with her public image. On screen, she was perfection incarnate. In life, she felt broken. Hollywood promoted her as untouchable, but each time Gene looked at her daughter, she saw the brutal reminder of how fragile her world truly was. She and Cassini clashed over how to handle Daria's care. Jean wanted to shield her child, protect her from the gossip and judgment of the outside world. Cassini, pragmatic and ambitious, often treated the matter with a coldness Jean could not forgive. Their marriage, already strained, began to fracture under the weight of grief. And yet, Jean pressed forward with her career. The studio demanded it. She starred in Dragonwyck 1946, opposite Vincent Price, a gothic melodrama that showcased her as both vulnerable and commanding. She dazzled in The Razor's Edge 1946, holding her own beside Tyrone Power. Each film reinforced her reputation as one of Hollywood's brightest stars. But with each performance, Jean's inner life grew darker. The more she gave to the camera, the less of herself she seemed to have left. Her beauty became both her blessing and her prison. Photographers chased her endlessly. Magazines exalted her as the most beautiful woman in Hollywood, and fans worshipped her with an intensity that left her feeling alien. Everyone saw her face, but few cared about her soul. Even those closest to her often treated her as a symbol rather than a person. Directors saw a muse, husbands saw a trophy. Audiences saw perfection. Jean herself began to feel invisible inside the image she projected. By the late 1940s, Jean was at the peak of her fame, but the foundations of her personal life were crumbling. Her second daughter, Christina, born in 1948, brought her joy, but also reminded her of the child she could never fully save. Her marriage with Cassini teetered between reconciliation and collapse, filled with fiery arguments, separations, and eventual divorce. Jean, the goddess on screen, was increasingly fragile in private. Friends noticed her mood swings, her exhaustion, her moments of strange detachment. The whispers of instability had begun. Still, Hollywood was relentless. She starred in The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, 1947, a tender, romantic fantasy that revealed a softer side of her talent. The film became a classic, cementing her versatility. But for Jean, the story of a woman haunted by a ghost mirrored her own existence. She too was haunted by guilt, by grief, by the sense that her life was slipping away from her even as the world applauded. It was during this period that Jean began to live in two worlds. In public, she remained radiant, poised, and magnetic. On red carpets, she dazzled with gowns that shimmered beneath flashbulbs. On screen, she delivered performances that kept audiences entranced. But in private, she was fragile, exhausted, and lonely. The cost of perfection was becoming unbearable. The late 1940s should have been Gene Tierney's golden age. Instead, it became the prelude to her downfall. The cracks were deepening, and though audiences could not see it yet, Jean herself felt them widening with each passing day. Stardom had given her everything: beauty, fame, recognition, but it had also taken away her peace, her joy, and her ability to forgive herself. She was standing on the highest peak of her career, but the view was terrifying. Ahead of her loomed the shadows she could not yet name, the battles she would soon be forced to fight. The world adored Gene Tierney, but Gene Tierney was beginning to lose herself. By the early 1950s, the cracks in Gene Tierney's carefully maintained facade were no longer hidden. The goddess of the screen, once hailed as untouchable, was showing signs of exhaustion that no amount of makeup or lighting could disguise. Her beauty remained intact, almost eerily so, but her spirit was faltering. The endless applause, the flashing bulbs, the weight of perfection, it was all becoming unbearable. The guilt she carried over her daughter Daria had not diminished. Jean often visited her child, who lived in a special care facility, and each visit tore open wounds that never healed. She longed to be the mother Daria needed, yet Hollywood demanded her time, her image, her soul. She could never reconcile the two. In her mind, she had failed as both a mother and a woman. That guilt metastasized into despair, and despair soon began to erode her grip on reality. Her personal life spiraled further. Her marriage to Oleg Cassini ended in divorce, leaving her with not just heartbreak, but also the sting of public scrutiny. The gossip columns feasted on her pain, painting her as unstable, difficult, even dangerous. Hollywood, always quick to exploit beauty, was equally quick to turn its back when beauty faltered. By 1953, Jean was battling severe depression. She withdrew from friends, missed appointments, and often seemed detached, even on set. The final blow came when she attempted to continue working despite her illness, only to find herself unable to perform. Hollywood had little patience for vulnerability. Soon, Gene Tierney, the woman who once defined elegance on screen, was being described as washed up. It was a brutal fall from grace, and one that revealed the cruelty of the industry she had once conquered. Her family, alarmed by her deterioration, sought medical help. But the medical practices of the era were far from compassionate. Jean was admitted to psychiatric institutions where she underwent electroconvulsive therapy, a treatment that left her disoriented, frightened, and stripped of dignity. In her later memoir, she would write bitterly about those days, the locked wards, the endless shocks, the way she felt less like a human being and more like a specimen. What was meant as treatment often felt like torture. Each session erased fragments of her memory, including lines of dialogue she once knew by heart, and even the ability to recognize herself. The public was shielded from these details, of course. The studios kept her illness a secret as best they could, releasing carefully curated statements about her health. But rumors spread. Hollywood whispered about breakdowns, scandals, and madness. Jean, once celebrated as a vision of perfection, was now gossiped about as a fallen star. In a town that thrived on illusions, her reality was too uncomfortable to confront. Yet, through all this, there were moments of resilience. After being discharged from one institution, she briefly returned to acting. In the late 1950s, she appeared in a handful of films, but the spark was dimmed. The luminous presence that had once mesmerized audiences was still there, but now it carried a weight, a sadness that could not be disguised. Viewers who had adored her in Laura or Leave Her to Heaven now saw a shadow of that goddess. Jean herself knew it. Acting, once her liberation, now felt like a reminder of all she had lost. Still, she refused to disappear entirely. In the 1960s, she slowly rebuilt fragments of her life. She wrote candidly about her struggles, becoming one of the first Hollywood stars to openly discuss mental illness. In doing so, she broke a taboo that the industry had long maintained, the idea that stars were flawless, untouchable, immune to suffering. Jean's willingness to share her story was both brave and groundbreaking, though it cost her whatever remained of her mystique. She was no longer just the emerald-eyed goddess, she was also a survivor of madness. But survival came at a cost. The scars of her treatments, the memories of being institutionalized, the knowledge that the world had seen her fall, these never left her. She withdrew from the spotlight, retreating into a quieter existence, away from the relentless demands of Hollywood. For a woman once described as unforgettable, She now craved anonymity. The tragedy of Gene Tierney was not simply her breakdown, it was the way the world responded to it. Instead of compassion, she was met with judgment. Instead of support, she was given shock treatments. Instead of being remembered for her talent, she was whispered about as a cautionary tale. And yet, in those whispers lay a cruel irony. Hollywood had created her image, worshipped it, and then destroyed her when she could no longer live up to it. She had once been the woman everyone wanted to see. Now she was the woman everyone wanted to forget. But Gene Tierney's story, with all its pain and darkness, was far from over. The fall was devastating, but it was also the beginning of a slow, fragile climb toward redemption. The world of Hollywood had already moved on by the time Gene Tierney emerged from the shadows of her darkest years. The studios that once fought for her signature now saw her as a liability, a star whose glow had been dimmed by whispers of madness. For Gene, this rejection was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because she had built her identity on the stage and screen. Liberating because, for the first time, she was free to live without the crushing burden of perfection. The 1960s became a period of reflection, struggle, and slow healing. Gene wrote openly about her experiences in her memoir, Self-Portrait, a raw and unflinching account of her battle with mental illness. In it, she described the humiliations of psychiatric treatment, the despair of being locked away, the loss of memory caused by electroshock therapy. But more than anything, she described the loneliness, the silence of a world that didn't know how to embrace someone who had fallen from grace. By daring to tell the truth, Gene became one of the first Hollywood stars to pull back the curtain on mental illness, giving a voice to countless others who had suffered in silence. Her courage to speak openly was, in itself, a form of redemption. In an industry that worshipped illusions, Gene chose honesty. She risked her reputation to share her pain, and in doing so, she helped dismantle the stigma that surrounded mental health. Readers of her memoir did not see a fallen goddess. They saw a woman who had endured, survived, and still carried herself with dignity. For many, Gene became not just a symbol of beauty, but also of resilience. In her personal life, Gene began to rebuild. She remarried in 1960 to Texas oil baron Howard Lee, and moved away from the glare of Hollywood into a quieter life in Houston. The marriage provided her with stability and a sense of grounding that she had long craved. For once, she could live as Gene, not as Gene Tierney, Hollywood's goddess. She could host dinners, walk through gardens, and live in peace without flashbulbs tracking her every move. The emerald eyes that once haunted millions now looked toward a horizon of simplicity. Yet the consequences of her past were never far away. Gene continued to struggle with depression, though she managed it with far greater awareness and acceptance. She never denied her fragility. Instead, she embraced it as part of who she was. She knew she could never undo the tragedy of her daughter's illness or the scars left by psychiatric institutions, but she found a way to live with those wounds. They became part of her story, not the whole of it. Her daughter Daria remained in specialized care throughout her life, and Gene visited when she could. Each visit reopened the well of sorrow, but also strengthened Gene's determination to endure. She knew that her love for Daria was eternal, even if her guilt never fully faded. Her second daughter, Christina, became a source of comfort and companionship, offering Gene the maternal bond she had always longed for. As the years passed, the public slowly re-embraced her, though in a different way. No longer the flawless goddess, she was now seen as a woman of grace and resilience. She occasionally appeared in films and television, though sporadically, her roles fewer and farther between. In 1962, she had a memorable part in Advise, Consent, proving she could still command the screen. But her career never returned to its former heights, and Gene accepted that. She no longer needed the adoration of millions, she needed peace. That peace came not from the applause of others, but from within. Gene spent her later years writing, painting, and reflecting. She became an advocate for mental health awareness, her story inspiring countless others to seek help without shame. In interviews, she spoke candidly about her struggles, her survival, and the lessons she had learned. "I never asked to be perfect," she once said. "I only asked to be human. It took me half my life to learn how to accept that." By the 1970s and 1980s, Gene Tierney was no longer the mysterious woman on the screen. She was something deeper, a reminder that even the most luminous stars are human beings, capable of breaking, capable of healing, capable of living beyond the illusions of fame. Her final years were quiet, spent in the company of family, surrounded by the love she had long sought. She died in 1991 at the age of 70, leaving behind not just a legacy of unforgettable films, but also a legacy of honesty, resilience, and survival. The consequences of Gene Tierney's life were harsh. The loss of her daughter's health, the destruction of her career, the brutal treatments that scarred her mind, but her redemption lay in her refusal to hide, in her courage to tell the truth, and in her ability to find peace despite everything she endured. Her story reminds us that beauty is not salvation, that fame is not fulfillment, and that the greatest triumph is sometimes simply surviving. Gene Tierney did not leave behind the flawless image Hollywood demanded. She left behind something far more powerful: the truth behind the emerald eyes. When Gene Tierney passed away in November 1991, the obituaries tried to capture her in a single line: the most beautiful woman in Hollywood, star of Laura, and leave her to heaven. But Gene Tierney's legacy is far too complex to be condensed into glamour and titles. Behind the emerald eyes was a story of survival, of fragility, of the human cost of fame. Today, she remains a figure both celebrated and mourned, a star whose brilliance was matched only by the shadows that pursued her. Her films endure as timeless classics. Laura is still considered one of the greatest film noirs ever made, its atmosphere inseparable from the mystery of her presence. Leave Her to Heaven continues to shock new audiences with her performance as Ellen Barrett, reminding us of her extraordinary ability to transform beauty into menace. These films keep her alive on screen, where she remains forever young, forever flawless, forever untouchable. But when we step away from the screen and look at her life, a different kind of legacy emerges, one that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about Hollywood itself. What does it mean to be adored for beauty? For Gene, it meant becoming a symbol rather than a woman, an icon rather than a person. The industry placed her on a pedestal and then shattered her when she could not sustain the illusion. She was praised for perfection, yet punished for imperfection. In this sense, Gene's story is not just about one woman. It is about the system that consumed her. She became a cautionary tale of how Hollywood worships its idols until they are human and then discards them. Yet, paradoxically, her willingness to reveal her flaws became her truest gift to the world. Long before it was fashionable, Gene Tierney spoke openly about mental illness. At a time when depression and psychiatric treatment were cloaked in shame, she had the courage to say, "This happened to me." She told the truth about the electroshock therapy that nearly erased her, about the loneliness of being institutionalized, about the despair that no amount of fame could cure. By sharing her story, she gave hope to others who felt alone in their suffering. In many ways, this candor is her most enduring contribution, more valuable even than her beauty or her films. But Gene's legacy is not without its haunting questions. Was she ever truly happy? Did she ever forgive herself for the tragedy of Daria's birth? Did she find peace in the quiet life she built in Texas, or did the ghosts of her past follow her until the end? No biography, no interview, no memoir can answer these questions fully. Perhaps that is why her story still resonates, because it remains unfinished, unresolved, and profoundly human. To watch Gene Tierney's films today is to feel a mixture of awe and sadness. Awe at her screen presence, sadness at the knowledge of what lay behind it. When she gazes into the camera in Laura, those emerald eyes seem eternal, but we now know they carried pain that no camera could capture. Her image is immortal, but the woman was fragile, and therein lies the contradiction that defines her legacy. In a way, Gene's story mirrors the very nature of Hollywood itself. The silver screen immortalizes illusions, while the reality behind them fades into tragedy. We remember the dream, but forget the dreamer. And yet, Gene Tierney fought to ensure she would not be forgotten as just a dream. She wanted to be remembered as a human being, flawed but resilient, broken but enduring. Her legacy, then, is twofold. On one side, she is the goddess, the unforgettable vision in velvet shadows, the woman whose beauty defined an era. On the other, she is the survivor who dared to expose the darkness behind the glamour. Both legacies coexist, and both are true. To ignore one is to misunderstand the other. Even today, new generations discover her films and ask, who was she really? They see the mystery of Laura, the obsession of Leave Her to Heaven, the tenderness of The Ghost and Mrs. Muir. They are captivated by her image, as audiences once were. And then they learn of her life, her daughter's illness, her breakdowns, her treatments, her resilience, and the image becomes something more. It becomes a reminder that behind every star is a human story, often more dramatic than the scripts they performed. In the end, Gene Tierney's greatest legacy may not be her beauty, her films, or even her courage. It may be the lesson her life teaches, that perfection is a lie, that beauty is fragile, and that survival itself can be the most heroic act of all. As the curtain falls on her story, we are left with those emerald eyes forever staring at us from the screen. Eyes that dazzled, eyes that haunted, eyes that concealed a lifetime of pain and perseverance, eyes that remind us that even gods and goddesses are human. And so, the question lingers, as it always will. Was Gene Tierney truly the most beautiful woman in Hollywood, or was she all along the most tragic?